Hey. Yeah, so, Julia, sometimes she'll point out when I seem burdened, and if I seem burdened, sometimes that gets taken as like a negative, like a holistic negative, I'll wait till you're not burdened, because things don't usually come out well when you're burdened, but it's kind of like the vibe you get from that thought. But I don't think that's absolutely true. In fact, I think a lot of what the Lord has built up inside of me looks like burden, looks like a burden in my heart to see things change. And I don't know, there's something definitely about it being a burden, because a burden could also, I think, look like a hunger, A burden could also, I think, look like a hope, a desire. And I think sometimes a desire without hope, or at least, I don't know, I think sometimes that can result in burden. But I do think that there is something that is a burden when you're part of the process of something. Like you want to see that thing come to be. And so sometimes your personhood that's involved inside of that, and whatever your role is in that, can be the thing that causes burden. And so there's just a lot here when it comes to burden. But I do think that in general, Jesus's yoke is easy and his burden is light. And I do think that in reality, we're moving to a place of trust in the Lord in a way that significantly impacts burdens in the way that we carry them, in such a way that makes them light. The thing that we're carrying light. And so I think that our awareness of what we're carrying can make it, like our awareness of the importance of what we're carrying, depending on our view of that thing, can result in us having a heavy burden in our heart toward that thing. It doesn't mean that thing is wrong, and it doesn't mean that having a burden in our heart is not appropriate. But what it might mean is that we have clarity of the burden itself, right? The thing that we're carrying. And ideally in life, we would always be accomplishing far more than we can accomplish. Therefore, we would be carrying something that is far heavier than we can carry. And so in order to mature in such a way where the burden that we're carrying isn't overwhelming, I think that even if we have clarity of that burden, of that desire to an extent, we may not have clarity of the one who's carrying it and who we're yoked with, right? And that we're learning from him in the process. And so I think sometimes burden can be a result of feeling distance between you and the one you're yoked with, Jesus, who's making it light by his strength. And so I think that when we begin to look at the one we're yoked with more so than the thing that we are pulling, I think we can begin to experience a lighter yoke. And then there's something to be said about the way that a burden can also be likened to a hunger or a desire or a hope. Well, when you are anticipating a hope to actually move into reality, when you're anticipating and actually marveling and actually imagining and actually spending the time inside of your head to meditate on what it's going to look like when that hope comes into reality, and when you realize the one that you're connected with and his ability to bring that hope into reality, what may appear as a heavy burden might shift to a light burden, and then even into a joy. Because there's something about knowing that the hope will come to be that allows you to enter into the celebration of that ahead of time. And I think that that's a large portion of what faith looks like, is having peace that goes ahead of your understanding, that is having peace that goes ahead of the thing that you see, the thing that has not yet come to pass. And so sometimes I come here with a burden. And I think sometimes the invitation in that is probably to look at the one that I'm yoked with more so than what we're pulling. And it's wonderful, because as soon as you find yourself organically coming to the conclusion that I ought to be observing the person of Christ, you may find yourself an immediate increase in confidence when it comes to the accuracy of your observation, because all things are from him and all things are to him. And when Mary was simply sitting at his feet, admiring him in all her ways, he's pointing at her and saying she's doing the one thing that is required. You're concerned about many things. Few things are required, indeed only one, and she's found it. The one thing that the Lord God says is required is what she was doing. So when you find yourself, right, turning from your wicked ways and seeking his face, when you find yourself leaning not on your own understanding, but acknowledging him in all your ways, then you start to realize, oh, he will keep in perfect peace whose imaginations are fixed on him. He will keep in perfect peace. He will direct the paths of those who acknowledge him. He will heal the land of those who seek his face. So now you start to get yourself into alignment properly with your burdens, and you start to anticipate the hope, and your peace begins to run ahead of your understanding. And this peace is so important. It's the thing that Hebrews 4 says that we must not fail to enter into. And the way that we enter into it, according to Hebrews 4, is by mixing our faith with the word that God said. That's the way we enter into it. Now, faith, according to Hebrews 11 and like Hebrews 10, is the admiration of God himself. And as we admire and observe his reliability, it causes faith to spring up inside of us. That's why it says of Sarah, the authority of her faith rested in the one that made the promise, and she simply tapped in to his faithfulness. And that causes faith to happen inside of us. As we observe, as we seek his face, faith rises. And so, yeah. And so this is the whole big thing. And so, and then the wonderful thing about this is that not only do we begin to experience peace ahead of seeing something, the faith actually activates the promise and causes that thing to move into reality, according to Hebrews 11:33 and Hebrews 4:3 and even Hebrews 11:22. And so it's super important. And so again and again and again, we seek his face. And so that's this thing. And the funny thing is, because the reason I actually came here to Video Journal was to talk about leaven, because I feel like the Lord's reminding me that that's where things are meant to start, right? The starting place of zero. I believe we're meant to start at zero. I believe that between Jesus' teachings and like the Old Testament teachings, and sort of like the way that Jesus uses the words of like leaven, and the way that it's talked about as something that God wants to be like a regular practice of Israel, to have this feast of unleavened bread. And I think the way that Jesus talks about it, it becomes pretty clear that the Lord wants us to understand our dependence on Him, and that leaven becomes emblem of our dependence on Him. But I think it becomes even a little bit more specific than that, because the way that Jesus refers to it starts to make it appear more clearly as a propagation of thought. So now leaven isn't just having nothing, it's actually having empty mind to observe and listen. And I believe that can be likened to, dying daily, and this whole thing of being burnt down to ash, like this stones of emptiness thing that we find in Genesis 1:3, and also like the emblematic of like an altar and a sacrifice being burnt down to nothing again. And also like plows, tilling soil, and the soil, even the way that soil becomes nothing, the way that soil dismantles itself and becomes absolutely, without its original form. So that way the words of the Lord, the seed of the Lord, can actually go down into that soil and begin to rework those things that have been reduced to nothing. This is so cute right here. Those things that have been reduced to nothing, and actually transform those things into original intention. The Lord was also showing me that He Himself is the garden, right? So that's in Isaiah 61, it says, just as a garden causes what is sown into it to spring up, so the Lord causes righteousness and praise to spring up before all nations. So it's really wonderful, this way. But the Lord is likened to a garden here that causes what's sown to spring up. And so, and I believe that, something that's sown speaks about something that has died, because unless a seed goes into the ground and dies, it can't produce a harvest. So there's a death that takes place there, which I think is also, again, 0:11. But then there's also, there's inherent increase, right? For the joy set before Christ endured the cross, He died and He rose again. And in that resurrection, like a seed that was sown into the Lord who caused it to spring up, there's an increase. If a seed goes into the ground and dies, it will produce a harvest of 30, 60, even 100 times what was sown. And so we sow ourselves into the Lord, and He causes us to spring up. And in order to do that, you die. You go back to zero propagation of thought, unleavened bread, burnt down to nothing, ashes to oak, right? So there's a whole massive, gorgeous progression of this. But I think it's just so important to realize that we die into the Lord. And from this place of zero propagation of thought, where you're not thinking about a lot of stuff, actually thinking about nothing, He's been showing me to seek His face in that spot. And I like to go birding. It's what I'm going to do right now. And I like to go to a place where I can unfocus my mind and stare at a line of bushes or a tree line, and with unfocused eyes look for movement anywhere to see if there's a bird. Because if I'm focusing on one spot, there could be movement over here and I'll miss it. But if I sit with unfocused eyes, 0:11, right, and just waiting to see what moves, I can watch the Lord this way in the house of my soul. And I like to look at it as a tree line, but He showed me that tree line is Himself, because all things are from Him. So as I'm waiting for things to come, I'm actually seeking His face again. And that's the one thing. Again, simply seek my face. And then it's also, because he's a garden, I'm not only just seeking his face, I'm not only looking at a tree line with unfocused eyes, I'm also observing with faith the thing that he is going to spring up out of what was sown into him. So I'm actually watching for movement, for little green shoots to come and pop up out of the soil of the garden of the Lord, to see what he's doing. And in that way, I only do what I see the Father doing, and I bless that thing. I bless that thing, that day of small beginnings, because in Zechariah 4:10, it says, "Don't regard as insignificant the day of small beginnings, for it delights the Lord to see the work begin." And in fact, his eyes are searching the whole world looking for anything like this. And so when I see that small beginning pop up out of the soil of the Lord, where I'm staring with unfocused eyes, listening to what he might be doing, that's like my brain being good soil to receive from him. And so it's amazing, because you start saying, well, is the Lord soil, or are you soil, or what's this and what's that? And the wonderful thing is, like, we're talking about heavenly realities that cannot be contained inside of this reality, and that's why it requires mixed metaphor. So you're actually just likening things that cannot be contained within our understanding to something that can be contained inside of our understanding, so we can understand that nature. And God gave us the world so we can do this with it. That's what he created, these systems and these clouds and these trees and these soils and all this stuff as a beautiful class that we can learn about him. And it's wonderful. And in this way, we take his yoke upon us and learn from him by connecting this way and just listening like a good student. And in this way, we put ourselves in class, right? By looking at the tree line with unfocused eyes. And I like to say, it is the responsibility of the teacher to reach the student, right? A good teacher will reach their students where they are, right? Take what they're interested in, take the topic points, take what they're looking at, and reach them where they are. But even if the teacher is perfect and will 100% reach you, if you're not in class, you don't have the benefit of a perfect teacher. And so in this way, we sit in class. We listen. And that's why, Proverbs 1:33 says, "The one who always listens to me." And then again in Matthew 13:12, Jesus says, "But the one who listens with a teachable heart will receive progressively more revelation until they have more than enough." And he says this right after he talks about good soil. So that's how our teachableness is like soil. But it's a little bit different now, because that's for us to receive from the Lord. But the Lord is like a garden that causes what's sown into him to spring up. So in that way, we look at his soil and to receive that small beginning. And then it translates into something that we can then, receive as revelation, like seed from the Lord, which is the word, which is the thing we mix our faith with. And so it's this whole beautiful, beautiful dynamic. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about is basically burden and the perception of burden shifting when you look not at the burden, but actually at the one you're yoked with. When you look not at the waves, but at the face of Jesus, we can't comprehend all the waves. We can't figure them out and sort them out, but we can understand his love and faithfulness, and that stabilizes us, and that causes us to have faith. We can't look at the burden of what we want to see happen and imagine how it will happen, but we can look at his ability and his power and be stirred in faith that way. You see? And so in this way, that changes the burden of our life, the burden for the things of the Lord into a place of hope and joy, and peace that's running ahead. And then you have the other thing I want to talk about, which was leaven, which is going back to nothing to actually receive new from him every day, like new leaven, not storing up what he told you yesterday for today, because that rots, because man doesn't live on bread alone, but from every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, right? And that's the Deuteronomy 8:3 lesson. Another lesson of the wilderness, which is all continually this lesson of dependence and connection. And it all ends with, prioritizing connection over everything, and not forgetting that lesson of the desert when you move into the promised land. We prioritize connection over everything. And that looks like sitting and looking at the tree line in the middle of everything, and not letting our own thoughts and understanding rise to the place where we're not anticipating the Lord. And we take the objects of our fear and we look at them in the light of his sure faithfulness and lordship in our life. And in that way, we take objects that are fearful things and we translate them out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. So this is another place of connection that we do in the house of our soul. But yeah, we prioritize connection over everything, because Jesus said the Son does nothing on his own, but he only does what he sees the Father doing. And then he said, I'm the vine, you're the branches, and apart from me, you can do nothing. So connection is so important, and that's why we take his yoke upon us and connect with him, and then learn from him as he actually flows life into us. I was reading about this today in Ephesians. Yeah. Anyways, amazing. So this is all the whole thing. So we got leaven, go back to 0 all the time, 0, leaven, let it all go. That's why I like, cold showers is really hard to remember anything after that. And then fasting is great for that too. Also, lack of sleep is an accidental boon there. And then you get, so there's your 0, leaven, and then you get the burden, but it all shifts when you seek his face instead of the understanding. So awesome.